I'm Adrian Kuzminski, author of The Ecology of Money, Debt, Growth, and Sustainability, and Fixing the System, A History of Populism, Ancient and Modern. Today's talk is entitled, Your Money or Your Life, How Modern Finance Threatens to Destroy the Planet and What We Can Do About It. We live in a time of accelerating ecological crisis. This crisis is widely recognized but poorly understood. I argue in this talk that our eco-crisis is a consequence not only of the impact of exponential economic growth on the environment, but that this growth is itself driven by something else, something more fundamental, namely by the demands of our financial system. We are in trouble because it looks like we no longer have the natural resources required to sustain such growth. Although it is increasingly recognized that our economy has been growing exponentially, and that this process at some point can no longer be sustained, there is no consensus as to why this has been the case. I hope to contribute here not just to an understanding of the nature of out-of-control growth, but more fundamentally to an understanding of what's driving it. To put the problem more plainly, we're trashing more and more of the planet in order to satisfy our increasingly insatiable demands. For those of us who recognize it, this is a kind of slow-motion catastrophe, one in which we seem to be trapped, one that's been a long time in the making, but one which is no less devastating for all that. The survival of humanity itself, perhaps even the planet as we know it, is in question for the first time in human history, not because of external forces beyond our control, but because of our own activities. This is not the place to demonstrate the nature and extent of our eco-crisis. There is a vast literature about that. Among many people, however, including most decision makers, considerable optimism remains in the face of this challenge. It is widely believed that technological breakthroughs of one sort or another, as so often in the past, will again step up to solve the increasing problems of resource scarcity, pollution, and climate change, thereby allowing us to stabilize our economies and our environment at a level sufficient to maintain, for most of us, something approximating our current standard of living. Maybe that will happen, or maybe not. History is always unpredictable. I, for one, remain less optimistic. I believe the evidence for planetary ecological dysfunction due to human activity is serious, even overwhelming, and not, at least not yet, so easily discounted. In what follows, however, I propose not to offer yet another description of the current crisis, nor to speculate on how easily or whether or not it can be resolved. Instead, I propose to look at what is causing the crisis and to consider what we can learn by attempting to understand the roots of the dilemma we face. So then, how did we get in this mess? Well, the eco-catastrophe, marked by climate change, resource depletion, species extinction, pollution, etc., is now widely recognized, described, and analyzed almost to death. Its causes, I believe, remain poorly understood. Many explanations are advanced, including overpopulation, technology, capitalism, human nature, moral decay, biological imperatives, non-holistic thinking, you name it. None of these explanations, in my opinion, is satisfactory. Most of them are the consequences, not the causes, of what got us into trouble in the first place. I want to propose here a different explanation, one that takes us back over 300 years. I propose that the root cause of our global predicament lies in our peculiar financial system, as I shall explain in what follows. My best critics, including my wife, ask how I can be so presumptuous as to propose a single unitary explanation for something so complex. Let me try to explain. Historians used to love overarching reductionist historical explanations. They used to seriously entertain Marxist theories about why events occurred, and psychoanalytic theories, and racist theories, and geographical theories, and many others. These days, historians have distanced themselves from this sort of preoccupation. They don't like to talk about root causes or simple explanations for complex events, and they are often right not to do so. Grand theories of history, after all, were often too long on speculation and too short on evidence. But the proliferation of causes can become self-defeating. Too many explanations, after all, can end up as no explanation at all. Perhaps for this reason, the historical approach to understanding our problems is invoked these days less and less, leaving us more and more in the dark about the pressing issues of our time. The presumption that there must be multiple causes for everything that happens can in fact blind us to what's really going on. It would be just as presumptuous to rule out that there may be, as often in the sciences, simple, unifying explanations for complex events, such as the theory of evolution or the cosmologies of Newton or Einstein. It may be, in fact, that there is a basic cause of our global ecological crisis, and indeed, I'm going to argue that there is. Take this not as a dogmatic claim, but as a hypothesis to be considered for what it's worth, to be put to the test like any other. The deeper cause of our problem, in my opinion, is a very specific financial system, one which was first developed in northwestern Europe about 300 years ago. That system changed history. It not only made possible, but more importantly, made unavoidable and even irresistible a wholly new, entirely unprecedented financial economic dynamic, one which for the first time created a built-in imperative for growth, and thereby led to the Industrial Revolution and to the modern world as we know it. Before the Industrial Revolution, just about everyone lived more or less sustainably on renewables. Local society collapses certainly occurred. Historian Joseph Tainter lists over 20 cases of such collapse. When collapse comes this time, however, it promises to be global and far worse than anything in the past. The difference is that our modern financial system has accelerated economic development by orders of magnitude, allowing us grossly to deplete our natural capital, taking us far beyond any sustainable baseline. It is difficult to overstate the significance of this radical, indeed revolutionary change introduced by our modern financial system. It is the difference between the modern world of exponential growth, driven by a very specific monetary system on the one hand, and, on the other hand, the pre-modern world of a steady-state, reciprocal, sustainable economy, where money facilitates but does not dominate commerce. Seen in this light, the European financial revolution ranks among the very greatest turning points of human history, perhaps comparable only to the Neolithic revolution in agriculture, which, thousands of years ago, led to the first cities, to writing, and to complex, settled societies. Let's then go back in time. The roots of our current financial economic dynamic lie in a financial revolution which occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries. It first began in Holland, but was brought to completion in England. It was in those countries that modern credit and finance as we know them were first invented. Prior to this time, credit was important, but arguably peripheral rather than central to economic life, most of which circulated around direct exchanges in local markets for local labor, local goods, and local services. More basically, these local exchanges, and even such long-distance exchanges as supplemented them, remained within the circle of sustainable production based on traditional agriculture, the seasons, and renewable forms of energy such as wood, wind, and water power. Debts were important, but almost always had to be discharged within a relatively brief seasonal or entrepreneurial cycle. The next crop, say, or the return of a trading caravan or a merchant fleet. The failure of a crop or expedition financed through borrowing usually meant liquidation, with little opportunity to restructure the debt. This natural check meant that the financial system, and especially the debt burden, could never get too far from reality. The financial revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries changed all that. It collectively brought the traditional state of affairs, the traditional economy, to an end. It was the Dutch who led the way. They invented the first modern system of national credit, a most remarkable innovation. They institutionalized credit on a national scale through national institutions, something never before achieved. For the first time in European and arguably world history, we find a credit system not dependent solely on the vicissitudes of private bankers like the Medici or the Fuggers, or the rich money-lending aristocrats of antiquity like Crassus or Lucullus. Such wealthy private lenders dealt mostly on a personal basis with unreliable private debtors, like monarchs consumed by endless warfare, or spendthrift noblemen or merchants engaged in risky projects. It was the Dutch, I suggest, who first institutionalized the discovery that the best use of money is to make more money. Flush with the success of their trading fleets in the Age of Discovery, they invested their commercial profits back into further overseas ventures. They did so through the innovation of the joint stock company, the first modern type of corporation, the most famous one being the Dutch East India Company, in which private investors could purchase shares. These shares were traded through another Dutch innovation, the stock market. A further innovation was central banking. The first functional central bank is often said to have been the Wisselbank, the Exchange Bank of Amsterdam, a public bank founded in 1609. Prior to this time, most overseas commerce was funded on a voyage-by-voyage basis, with investors organized into ad hoc groups which dissolved after each project. The genius of the Dutch East India Company was to offer to investors perpetual shares in an ongoing enterprise, the first significant joint stock company in Europe. Shares could not be redeemed, but they could be bought from and sold to third parties. In addition, shareholders were paid regular dividends at a high rate, reflecting the company's success. Control of the company, moreover, was confined to the management, with the shareholders in effect silent partners. The result was a well-run enterprise whose shares were in constant demand. This dovetailed nicely with the Amsterdam stock market, the Bourse, the first real stock market in Europe. Similar stock markets soon appeared in London and elsewhere, including Frankfurt and Paris. In the 17th century, hundreds of these joint stock companies for domestic as well as foreign commerce were created and traded on these exchanges, though only a few persisted for long. The Wisselbank of Amsterdam, Wissel meaning bill of exchange, was founded to meet the demand for more complex financial transactions, including deposits and transfer payments arising from increased trade and investment. This powerful combination of institutions made Holland far and away the financial capital of Europe. Dutch financial institutions were democratically accountable to a surprising degree and were designed for broad public participation. Credit after the Dutch financial revolution was backed in that country by publicly guaranteed, more or less perpetual national institutions. The Bourse and the Bank of Amsterdam had behind them the imprimatur of the collective corporate backing of the provinces and towns, who not only had a say in financial policy, but a veto over it. This was true public banking, and it was an extraordinary success. The resulting wide distribution of wealth in Holland was remarked upon. Even peasant cottages in the countryside, travelers reported, boasted fine furniture, even oil paintings. This brings us to the fateful turning point of our story. Though an indispensable part of the original financial revolution, the Dutch system of public finance represents a path not taken in subsequent financial history. What happened next is one of the great but seldom recognized twists of history. Holland's financial innovations gave that small country an outsized financial capacity, one which enabled it to defeat a Spanish empire at the height of its power for its independence and to become the financial center of Europe. But it wasn't enough. Too small to fend off British competition and naval power, and pressed by France on land, the Dutch investors struck up an alliance with the moneyed men of the City of London after James II came to the British throne in 1685. James was a Catholic and favored an alliance with Catholic France, which was intent on subduing the Protestant Dutch. The Dutch reached out to their Protestant London financial counterparts and helped engineer a coup deposing James II in favor of the Dutch leader William of Orange, who became King of England. This was the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688. The financial interests in London saw an opportunity in all this political turmoil. They recognized the importance of Dutch financial innovations and saw the advantage of establishing similar credit institutions in Britain, a central bank, a national debt, money markets. British finances had long been in disarray. Charles II had actually defaulted on his loans in 1671, and much instability remained. The moneyed men of London recognized that some kind of reform of British finance along the lines of the Dutch innovations was required to achieve stability and to protect their interests. But why, they seem to have asked themselves, why should these new financial institutions be under public rather than private control? The London goldsmiths a few decades earlier had discovered what we call fractional reserve banking. They realized that they could lend out far more money than their clients had on deposit with them, as long as those clients didn't all rush in at once to withdraw their gold. This new ability to literally create new money through overextended credit proved a tempting option for the financial interests in London. Even more tempting was the opportunity to charge high or usurious rates of interest on these loans. In an accountable system of public finance, as in Holland, usurious rates are more liable to popular pushback. In a private system, however, it's easier to charge what the market for loans will bear. Why then, the British moneyed men asked, shouldn't credit be made available through a privatized banking system, free to charge whatever interest the market could bear, rather than through a public system like the Dutch, charging only low or nominal interest, supposedly for the benefit of the public good? Why shouldn't the monopoly over money creation be privatized? And that's exactly what happened. It's important to understand the nature of the fateful British reworking of Dutch finance. The essence of the New English system was the creation of money through usurious lending to the public and to the government by a privatized central banking system, which was given a monopoly on issuing government debt or notes as legal tender in return for providing the government with much-needed funding. This was accomplished, first, by giving bankers a legal monopoly over money creation through issuing loans. Second, by creating a national debt issued by a central bank to backstop private lending and to support the new financial system. And third, by privatizing money creation, allowing bankers to charge high or usurious rates of interest on loans for their own personal profit. In the words of financial historian Henry Roseveare, quote, "What had been created by the incorporation of the Bank of England was something more precious than cash, and that was credit," end quote. Usurious credit, that is. Usury, of course, is the practice long banned by the Church of charging interest on loans beyond any reasonable costs and risk to the lender, limited pretty much only by what the market for loans will bear. Let's look more closely at how this happened. The Bank of England, established by an Act of Parliament in 1694, assumed the personal debt of the monarch, turning it into a national debt. But though the debt was now made national, subject to repayment by the government through money collected through taxation, the bank, in spite of its name, was privately owned by its 1,500 or so initial investors. Instead of depending on the whims of its depositors and borrowers, like most earlier lenders and banks, who were often, as a result, left liable to default, the Bank of England was backed by the taxing power of the state, which stood ready to guarantee payments of government bonds. This made it far more secure and, as we might say today, too big to fail. But it was the bank, that is, its investors, who pocketed the usurious interest on those bonds and other loans they were now free to charge, while evading any significant public accountability for their policies. Its notes, payments to borrowers, circulated as legal tender, as British pounds, and gradually became the dominant currency of the land. At the same time, operating on a fractional reserve lending basis, the banking system was able to create, through repeated lending and relending, more money than ever before. Here's how historian Christopher Hollis sums up the deal that put the new system into practice. Quote, "The plan was that the government should borrow £1,200,000, of which it was in need, from a newly formed corporation called the Bank of England. This corporation promised to collect the required money from the public and to lend it to the king at 8%, plus £4,000 per annum for expenses, a rate considerably lower than that which he would have to pay to the goldsmiths. In return for lending at this low rate, the bank received a number of privileges, of which the most important was that it had the right to issue notes up to the extent of its loan to the government, under their common seal, on the security of the government. This is to say, it had the right to issue a £1 note. The holder of that £1 note had the right to demand that the bank give him cash for his note. But If he made that demand, the bank had the right to demand that the government raise that £1 by taxation and repay £1 worth of debt to the bank so that the bank might repay its £1 to the note holder. As Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli later put it, the principle of that system was to mortgage industry in order to protect property. Or, as Patterson, the originator of the bank, himself explained with charming simplicity, the bank hath benefited the interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. End quote. The notes put into circulation by the bank were literally created out of nothing, since the money they represented had already been loaned to the government and spent on military and other expenses. But since it was owed back to the bank by the government, it could stand as collateral for further notes issued by the bank. That is, a further round of lending, this time to the public. The key idea, a most ingenious invention, was to use old debts as collateral for new ones, and to put these new notes or debt money into circulation as the currency of the nation. And all this on a fractional reserve basis with its built-in multiplier effect. The original money put up by the Bank of England's original investors, the £1,200,000 which first funded the bank, may have been directly or indirectly commodity money, such as gold or gold certificates. But the notes issued on the collateral of the debt held by the bank after lending to the government were simply promissory notes, lent out at interest. These notes could be converted into cash upon demand, but since they functioned as money in every other way and had the imprimatur of the state behind them, the incentive for demanding cash, that is, some form of commodity money, faded away. In short, credit money, as a result of the financial revolution, came to replace commodity money for all practical purposes. The tether to commodity money, to be sure, was maintained for centuries afterwards by the gold standard. Indeed, it was not finally abandoned until 1971, when President Nixon took the United States off the international gold standard. But the fundamental shift to credit at usurious rates had nonetheless been accomplished long before. The financial innovations the British added to those of the Dutch, we might add, were not confined to the pernicious institutionalization of usurious debt money by the Bank of England, central as that was. An additional, more benign ingredient perfected in Britain was the development of the first real financial securities market in the world, within which the bank played a central role. A few other financial institutions, including the South Seas Company, the East India Company, and the Million Bank, played similar roles in facilitating the circulation of credit, though the Bank of England came to dominate the field. Historian P.G.M. Dixon puts the importance of securities markets this way, quote, "For unless facilities had existed to enable lenders to lend to a third part, to sell to a third party their claim on the state to annual interest, the government system of long-term borrowing would never have got off the ground. The state would have been obliged to promise repayment in a limited number of years and to keep their promise. This would have effectively stopped it from borrowing on the scale it needed. The rise of the market solved the dilemma by, to adapt a Keynesian phrase, making debts that were permanent for the state liquid for the individual, subject only to the risk of capital loss if market prices fell." End quote. This system was made permanent by the recognition that the national debt never had to be repaid, but could be continually turned over by selling new securities to replace those coming due. To sum up, the new credit economy was given a new and fateful twist in Britain. Instead of a system of public credit avoiding usury, which the Dutch pioneered, British financial interests opted for a privatized, for-profit, usurious credit system backed by the state, but not accountable to it. Their new financial power, moreover, gave them increasing influence over the state and its policies. A new investor class arose, combining the old landed wealth of the aristocracy with the new financial opportunities pioneered by bankers and merchants in commercial centers like Amsterdam and London. Since it invented the modern credit system, and few others understood it then as now, this new investor class was able to privatize and perpetuate it in its own and not in the public's interest. Dixon had no hesitation in calling this class from the beginning a plutocracy. This opened the floodgates to the large-scale issuance of debt, that is money, far beyond what even the Dutch were able to do. Holland was more decentralized than England. It was an association of 7 largely autonomous Dutch states, each of which, as we've seen, retained a veto over their common financial interests. As a result, the national debt could not be exploited there to the degree it came to be exploited in Britain, that is, up to what the market could bear. This new financial system in its English form was explicitly designed to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few creditors at the expense of many debtors. However, the resulting inequalities were by and large tolerated as long as economic growth produced a growing economic pie for creditors and debtors alike to divide up. In the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, from, say, the early 19th to the late 20th centuries, an ever-growing debt burden could be absorbed and discharged by continued, seemingly endless economic development. Since credit allows me to defer payment, to spend money now without having to balance my books until later, it allows for investments not otherwise possible, and therefore for production which would not otherwise occur. It allows us to draw against the future, not merely the present. But if credit is made widely available only on usurious terms, as turned out to be the case in modern Europe, beginning with Britain, then additional production is not only possible, but necessary. If your business depends on repaying back more than you borrow to finance it, you are compelled to grow whether you like it or not. To reiterate, for credit to become dominant in commercial arrangements, it needs the backing of the state. That is, the willingness of the state to guarantee not only the stability of its new currency, but also to provide reliable security for loans made with it, generally by backing up the system through taxation. When usury is added to the mix, the whole system goes on steroids. This, as we've seen, is what the moneyed men of London managed to achieve in Britain at the end of the 17th century, exploiting the innovations of the Dutch for their own purposes. They realized something missed, or perhaps consciously avoided, by the Dutch, that not only could they leverage debt by loaning out more than they held in reserve, while piling on high interest rates, but that they could entrain the force of the state to guarantee such loans for their private benefit. They did it by transforming the personal debt of the monarch into a national debt held by wealthy elites backed by the taxing power of the state. And in a profound and fateful historical twist, they tacked on usury as a condition of most loans. Once usurious debt was backed by the tax revenues of the state, not only was debt made respectable, it became irresistible, and so came to dominate economic life. To say it again, a bit differently, the financial revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe not only made credit much more widely available, it transformed credit into an instrument of virtually unlimited money creation through a new kind of state-backed usurious financial system, resulting in a new kind of money. The Bank of England became the symbol of this English system, as Alexander Hamilton called it. Hamilton and his successors fervently worked to establish that system in America, in the face of powerful resistance from Jeffersonians, Jacksonians, mutualists, greenbackers, populists, and others. By the late 19th century, however, the English system had triumphed. It was finally institutionalized in America with the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. It has subsequently been exported to most of the rest of the world. With the opening of China to foreign investment beginning in the 1970s, and with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the English system, suitably evolved and modified, became the unchallenged, dominant global financial system. Today we tend to take this financial system for granted. It's all we've got, all we've ever known, and it seems as permanent as death and taxes. It's become part of what we imagine to be some kind of natural evolution of money and finance in society. 19th century American populists didn't take this system for granted. They called it the money power and opposed its establishment. They understood it was a deliberate human invention which could and should be undone. Since it gave private creditors, not governments, a monopoly over the creation of money for profit through lending at interest, they argued that creditors, in effect, were thereby able to levy a tax on debtors, a surcharge on every loan, calculated by the interest rate, thereby skimming wealth from the many into the hands of the few. The Bank of England played a crucial role in establishing the new system, not so much as a lender, but as a financial backstop for lending in general. Unlike earlier banks, it was able to rely, as we've seen, upon the taxing revenue of the state to back its bonds. And once the national debt became permanent, the system could seemingly go on forever. Here's why this is important. A permanent debt guaranteed for the first time a stable credit market, which in effect underwrote all other financial markets. The interest charged on government bonds issued by the bank set a standard for interest rates, something hitherto lacking. Since anyone could buy the bonds and get the going rate for their money, a benchmark level of expectation was set for all lending. What mattered, in other words, was not so much how much lending banks or anyone else did, but the fact that all lending, including private credit, was now effectively based upon the going usurious interest rate institutionalized in government bonds, more or less continually available to the public. The ultimate symbol of this system was the British consul, a consolidated perpetual annuity, hence the name, first offered by the government at 3.5% in 1752 and still available until recently. Now consider the next step. Once key sectors of the economy came to depend on money borrowed at usurious rates of interest, it became necessary to keep expanding economic output to keep up with payments. That happened first in agriculture, on the great estates in Britain in the 18th century, and then quickly spread to extractive, fabricating, and manufacturing industries. This legal obligation by borrowers to repay debts with significant interest is what, I believe, forced modern economies into relentless growth. Once commercial enterprises began to run on this kind of borrowed money, they not only had a powerful motive to expand, but one that could not be ignored. It was a pact with the devil. There might be no end of success and wealth beyond all imagination, but failure meant bankruptcy, if not debtor's prison. Those who led the way by investing borrowed money found that access to credit, even at usurious terms, led to improvements, as they called them in the 18th century. These resulted in innovations and efficiencies, boosting productivity, and these in turn brought greater profits and ultimately the ability to outcompete those unwilling or unable to convert to the new game in town, to the English system. This was the radical break from the traditional steady-state reciprocal sustainable economies of the past. In Britain by the 18th century, we see the first large nation-state economy beginning to run on usurious credit, rather than on land and the reciprocity of a traditional economy. That is, we see a new economy no longer confined to running on subsistence or renewable resources, but increasingly subject to imperatives pushing beyond them, pushing the envelope, including, above all, legal contracts committing debtors to pay back significantly more than they borrowed. This breakout from the constraints of traditional economies was the key to the rise of British power in the modern world, which in turn set the pattern for the United States, Britain's successor as world superpower. Britain's main rival, France, then the largest economy in Europe, remained hampered by the persistence of medieval practices in the Ancien Regime, which favored the continuation of a land-based economy of renewable but limited resources. The collapse of John Law's Mississippi Company in France stifled the kind of credit innovations which were moving ahead in Britain. Britain defeated France in the wars of the 18th and early 19th centuries because they could borrow money, as France could not, to fund superior military and especially naval forces. The French economists of the time, the physiocrats, still saw land and traditional reciprocal exchanges as the source of all wealth. And they were right, thinking in terms of sustainability, as they did implicitly. What they did not appreciate was the ability of humans to fashion practices that violate sustainability. Britain, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, found herself carrying a debt burden more than double the size of her economy, comparable to many current sovereign debt levels. Yet the astonishing explosion of industrial production in the decades which followed, along with the cessation of military expenditures associated with the Napoleonic Wars, allowed this debt to be absorbed and discharged, leaving room to issue more new debt, all on an ongoing basis. Debtors repaying even usurious loans, as we've noted, stood to benefit from a steadily growing economy. Traditional economies were thus displaced by growth economies, which were forced by their debt obligations to relentlessly seek out new markets, new technologies, new resources, and new labor. As a result, the Industrial Revolution and all of what we call modernity was born. Without the English system of finance, I suggest there would have been no Industrial Revolution as we have known it. This is not to say that technical innovation would not have continued as it had for centuries, only that it would have done so in a context in which the ability to defy ecological limitations was far less potent. Think of it as an historical what-if. This seemingly endless growth has been the touchstone of the modern economy for over 200 years. Even today, in spite of the eco-crisis and the disruptions following the crash of 2008, it is still widely presumed by most commentators that economic growth can somehow be resumed. Calls for the resumption of growth remain a virtually unquestioned mantra of the mainstream media and contemporary political discourse, which remains stubbornly deaf to the warning alarms of the limits of growth. Nearly 3 centuries of economic growth have given us the miracle of the modern world, with all of its astounding wealth and technology. Compare it to life just 200 years ago, when houses were heated by fireplaces, women often died in childbirth, land transport depended on livestock, ships on wind, communication on pieces of paper. There were no antibiotics, no effective anesthesias, no refrigerators, no planes, no trains, no phones, no motor vehicles, no computers, no a lot of things we take for granted. If you can imagine a life without electricity or gasoline, you're pretty much back there. Now we are seeing that this industrial miracle has also exhausted our planet, which staggers under the cumulative effects of resource depletion, pollution, overpopulation, species extinctions, climate change, and all the rest of it. Insofar as the limits to growth have been reached, we can no longer hope to repay our debts, as in the past, by growing our way out of the crisis. This is our fundamental problem. Today, the worst fears of 19th century American populists have come to pass. Our debt and interest-based financial system, the money power, has become not only too big to fail, but also too big to succeed. It has generated trillions, perhaps quadrillions, of dollars of debt, personal, corporate, and governmental, more debt than can ever be repaid. It can't be repaid because, as I've been arguing, we're running out of resources. There's only so much arable land, only so many fish in the sea, so many minerals and fossil fuels in the ground, so much clean air and water, and so on. Without the presumption of growth, which presupposes the continuous and exhaustive availability of fresh resources, the English system collapses. Unless we can migrate into some virtual reality in cyberspace, leaving behind our physical bodies, we end up facing the apparent verdict of history that we must learn to live on renewable resources on a finite planet. Facing this challenge is made more difficult by the dimming prospects for meaningful reform. The money power, at least since the age of the robber barons, has gradually but steadily solidified its control over the American economy and society at large, and most of the global economy as well. Today we are at the mercy of a political system largely corrupted by creditors, the financial interests, or Wall Street if you will, and largely unaccountable to its citizens. It ignores the urgency of reform, which may now be impossible, thus opening the potential for conflict and perhaps revolutionary change. Today, left and right, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, are united in a strange symbiotic dance, one which conveniently allows them to pass like ships in the night. The selective criticisms each make of the other are neatly deflected. Democrats rhetorically promote big government and criticize big business, and Republicans rhetorically promote big business and criticize big government. But they scratch one another's backs. Democrats tend to let big business off the hook, appeasing Republicans, while Republicans tend to let big government off the hook, appeasing Democrats. The result of this pseudo-debate is a curious power-sharing arrangement, which allows both parties and their backers to support both big government and big business. The military, police, regulatory, and surveillance powers of the government are unprecedented and unchecked, in spite of right-wing rhetoric about shrinking government. At the same time, too big to fail unregulated corporations, financial and industrial, stride the globe and dominate economic activity as never before, in spite of left-wing rhetoric about regulating corporations for the public good. All this benefits creditors at the expense of debtors, that is, the overwhelming majority, who have been stripped of real political and economic power. The traditional left versus right political straitjacket leads us astray in other ways. The left historically has explained social injustice mainly as the suppression of the laboring classes by capital. Capital, symbolized by big business, is the exploiting enemy for the left, and a powerful reforming government is its answer. The right historically has explained social injustice mainly through the suppression of citizens' rights by the government. Government, especially the federal government in Washington, is the exploiting enemy, and the restoration and preservation of individual liberty, symbolized by deregulation, low taxes, and gun ownership, is the answer for the right. Such is our politics. Both left and right wildly miss the mark. The tendency of the left to concentrate political power, when left unchecked, poses totalitarian risks, while the tendency of the right to liberate the individual, when left unchecked, leads to anarchy. Unaccountable state power run amok, just look at the surveillance state, is no solution. Neither is the indiscriminate dismantling of collective institutions and safeguards in the name of liberty. Just look at the millions living in insecurity and poverty while unregulated corporations and the military enjoy free reign. The root of our conflict is a different one, as I've been trying to explain. It is a conflict between creditors and debtors. This is an old struggle, much agitated in ancient times, subdued during the Middle Ages by the Church's ban on usury, but reinvigorated mightily since by the establishment of the English system, now dominant worldwide. Now this interwoven ecological and financial crisis, including the battle between creditors and debtors, is likely to play itself out no matter what we do. In the end, however, the survivors likely will need to adjust to a dramatic downsizing and a return to sustainable economic practices, something last seen on a societal level in the early 19th century in the West. To maintain a sustainable economy, they will need a new financial system which is compatible with it. What might that system be? Let me close by offering at least an outline of a solution, a sketch of what a public, non-usurious financial system might look like. If the cause of our predicament is the usurious, privatized, monopolistic financial system driving an economy of unsustainable exponential growth, then eliminating that system is essential in order to establish a steady-state economy. What can we put in its place which would be compatible with a sustainable economy? Somewhat surprisingly, the outlines of such a system actually exist. They were developed by an antebellum American businessman and financial theorist, Edward Kellogg. In various works, especially his posthumously published A New Monetary System of 1861, he proposed a decentralized system of public banking, in some respects taking up where the Dutch left off, where citizens could borrow on good collateral at a non-usurious rate of interest fixed by law, according to his calculations, at 1%. Kellogg's system, which inspired subsequent American populists, provides a compelling model for financing a future sustainable economy. The populists Kellogg inspired were the last important incarnation of a long Jeffersonian tradition resisting the money power and the concentration of interest it fostered, public and private, state and corporate. Populists, unlike the two-headed political system of today, oppose the money power in favor of a decentralized politics and economics based on essentially sustainable practices and accountable to the public. In pre-modern times, as we've seen, largely subsistence economies ran mostly on direct or reciprocal exchanges. One went to market with gold coins, say, and exchanged them directly for goods. The gold coins had an intrinsic value equal to the goods purchased, at least as agreed by buyer and seller, and the exchange was entirely satisfied by the transaction. With credit, however, as we've seen, one can make a purchase without giving an equivalent in exchange, only a promise to pay later. The completion of the transaction is deferred, complicating matters, but one's purchasing power is greatly enlarged. It is no longer necessary to save up money in order to spend it. Now, credit, and I hope this is clear, is itself a good thing, without which many vital investments could not be made, a school, a bridge, a hospital. What concerns us is the abuse of credit by usury. There is no reason, as Kellogg and the populists recognized, why, as a condition of having widespread credit, money has to be lent at an interest rate that is more than its replacement value. Surely, this appears to be no more than an arbitrary self-serving condition laid down by monopolistic bankers. Anyone who's had a mortgage or auto loan or education loan or credit card loan or any other sort of conventional loan, that is, nearly all of us, knows painfully well the size and burden of interest payments. All that is required for the fair repayment of a loan, Kellogg reasoned, is that the principal be restored to the lender, taking into account that the resources consumed in the transaction and spending of the loan are similarly restored. If only the principal were repaid without compensation for resources consumed, then more money would have to be created for the next loan, and so on, putting us back on the treadmill of endless borrowing and increasing debt. Sustainability, after all, requires that goods and services consumed be continually replenished, albeit with renewable resources. This would require, on technical analysis and Kellogg's view, an interest rate of about 1%. All this could be accomplished by a decentralized system of public banking as envisioned by Kellogg. Imagine going to your local public bank and, on adequate collateral, getting a very low interest rate to finance a home, a car, an education, a business, etc. The wealth previously skimmed off by creditors as usurious interest would instead be retained, in effect, by the borrowers, Credit would be available as a public service, not exclusively on a for-profit basis. Resources would be widely distributed in a manner compatible with sustainable practices, setting the foundation for prosperity and social justice in a steady-state economy. This is perhaps a utopian vision. Certainly it is not about to be implemented. Yet, as our financial and economic system spins out of control, it is important to have some awareness of possible viable alternatives, lest we make the same mistakes all over again. Let me close with a quotation from Kellogg, slightly amended, about the prospects of implementing his system, which he called the safety fund. Quote, "It may be admitted that the theory of the safety fund is good, but impracticable at present, that it is calculated for some future generation, when men shall have become more intelligent and virtuous. If the same faith as ours shall be held by the generations which are to follow us, it will be difficult to point out at what period this desirable reformation will occur, because the evil of our present system will always be in the present, and the good of the plan proposed will always be in the future. We are, however, persuaded that a large majority of the people are aware that their present depressed condition may and should be exchanged for something better, and the safety fund will be regarded by them as neither too utopian nor visionary to be made immediately operative for their benefit. All the objections to the proposed currency upon the..."
You're listening